The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as Captain James Wellington adjusted his ceremonial red tunic for what he believed would be the last time. After 23 years of faithful service to the crown, the decorated royal guard found himself standing at the crossroads between duty and conscience. Wellington had served 3 monarchs during his distinguished career. He remembered the dignity of Queen Elizabeth II, the brief reign of King Charles III, and now witnessed the controversial ascension of Queen Camilla to the throne following Charles's unexpected abdication. What troubled him most was not the change in leadership, but the circumstances surrounding it. The captain had access to corridors of power that ordinary citizens could never imagine. He had overheard hushed conversations between palace officials, witnessed heated exchanges between royal advisors, and observed the subtle manipulations that shaped public perception. What he discovered in recent weeks shook him to his core. During a routine security briefing, Wellington accidentally stumbled upon classified documents that questioned the legal basis of Camilla's coronation. The paper suggested that proper constitutional procedures had been bypassed in the rush to crown her after Charles's sudden departure from public life. Legal experts within the palace had raised concerns about the legitimacy of her claim, but their voices were quickly silenced. The weight of this knowledge pressed heavily on Wellington's shoulders as he walked through the palace halls. He noticed how staff members whispered among themselves, their loyalty clearly divided. Some supported the new queen out of tradition and obligation, while others harbored serious doubts about her right to rule. Wellington's own doubts began during the coronation ceremony itself. He stood guard as ancient rituals were performed, but something felt wrong. The ceremony seemed rushed, almost desperate. Key members of Parliament appeared uncomfortable, and several high-ranking officials were noticeably absent from the proceedings. His concerns deepened when he witnessed Queen Camilla's first official acts as monarch. She moved quickly to replace longtime palace staff with her own loyalists, effectively silencing potential opposition. Those who dared to question her decisions found themselves reassigned to remote positions or encouraged to retire early. The breaking point came when Wellington learned that evidence of the constitutional irregularities was being systematically destroyed. Important documents were being removed from royal archives, and witnesses to the questionable proceedings were being transferred away from London. It became clear that someone was working hard to erase any trace of doubt about the Queen's legitimacy. As a soldier, Wellington had sworn an oath to protect the crown and uphold the Constitution. But what happens when those two duties come into conflict? He spent sleepless nights wrestling with this dilemma, knowing that his next decision would change everything. The captain found himself remembering Queen Elizabeth II's words about duty and service to the people. She had always emphasized that the monarchy existed to serve the nation, not the other way around. This principle now guided Wellington as he considered his options. He began to notice other signs of discontent within the palace walls. Junior staff members shared worried glances when the Queen passed by. Senior advisors held secretive meetings behind closed doors. Even some of Wellington's fellow guards expressed private concerns about recent developments. The final catalyst came when Wellington discovered that several members of Parliament had filed a formal inquiry about the coronation process, only to have their investigation blocked by mysterious legal maneuvers. It became clear that powerful forces were working to prevent any scrutiny of Queen Camilla's rise to power. Standing in his quarters that evening, surrounded by medals and commendations for more than 2 decades of service, Wellington made his decision. He could no longer remain silent while the institution he had devoted his life to protecting was potentially being compromised. The captain understood the enormous risks involved in speaking out. He would face accusations of treason, lose his pension, and probably be arrested. His family would suffer and his reputation would be destroyed by those in power. But he also knew that history would judge him harshly if he remained silent while constitutional principles were being violated. Wellington spent the next several days carefully documenting everything he had witnessed and learned. He copied important papers, recorded conversations when possible, and gathered evidence that would support his claims. He knew that once he made his statement public, he would need proof to back up his accusations. As he prepared for what would likely be his final day as a royal guard, Wellington felt a strange sense of peace. He had always believed that true loyalty meant protecting the principles and values that the monarchy represented, even if it meant challenging the monarch himself. Today, he would put that belief to the ultimate test. The press conference was scheduled for 11 o'clock on a crisp Tuesday morning at the historic Royal Courts of Justice. Captain Wellington had chosen this location deliberately, knowing that its symbolism would not be lost on the media or the public. He arrived early, dressed not in his ceremonial uniform but in a simple dark suit, carrying only a leather briefcase containing the evidence he had gathered. Media representatives from around the world had gathered after receiving an urgent notice about a significant royal announcement. None of them knew what to expect, but the mysterious nature of the invitation had generated considerable excitement. Television crews set up their equipment while photographers jostled for the best positions. Wellington's lawyer, Margaret Thornton, had initially tried to dissuade him from this course of action. She understood the legal implications better than anyone, and warned him about the potential consequences. However, she was also deeply troubled by the evidence Wellington had shown her and eventually agreed to represent him. As the appointed time approached, Wellington felt his heart racing. He thought about his wife Sarah and their 2 children, knowing that their lives would never be the same after today. Sarah had supported his decision despite her fears, understanding that her husband's conscience would not allow him to remain silent. The room fell silent as Wellington approached the podium. Cameras flashed and reporters leaned forward, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary. The captain had never spoken to the media before, preferring the anonymity that came with his position, but today he would step into the spotlight. Wellington began by introducing himself and outlining his service record, establishing his credibility before making his shocking allegations. He spoke clearly and calmly, despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. His military training served him well as he maintained his composure under the intense scrutiny of the assembled media. The captain's first major revelation concerned the constitutional irregularities he had witnessed during the coronation process. He explained how key legal requirements had been overlooked or deliberately ignored in the rush to crown Queen Camilla. He provided specific examples of procedures that were not followed, and officials who had raised objections only to be silenced. Wellington then detailed the systematic efforts to destroy evidence of these irregularities. He described how documents were being removed from royal archives, and how witnesses were being transferred or intimidated into silence. He presented copies of papers he had managed to save, showing clear evidence of the cover-up. The room erupted in chaos as reporters realized the implications of Wellington's allegations. Some shouted questions while others rushed to file their stories, knowing that this would be front-page news around the world. The captain remained calm, methodically presenting his evidence and answering questions with military precision. One of the most damaging revelations concerned a secret meeting between Queen Camilla's advisors and certain government officials just days before the coronation. Wellington had overheard discussions about how to handle potential legal challenges to her claim to the throne. The meeting revealed a coordinated effort to suppress dissent and manipulate public opinion. Wellington also exposed the Queen's efforts to consolidate power by replacing longtime palace staff with her own supporters. He provided names and dates, showing how systematically she had moved to eliminate potential sources of opposition. Many of these dismissed employees had been silenced through generous severance packages that included strict confidentiality agreements. The captain's most serious allegation concerned the circumstances of King Charles's abdication. Wellington suggested that the king may have been pressured to step down under circumstances that were not entirely voluntary. While he was careful not to make direct accusations without absolute proof, his implications were clear enough to cause a sensation. As the press conference continued, Wellington presented audio recordings of conversations he had overheard between senior palace officials. These recordings revealed deep concerns about the legitimacy of the coronation process and discussed strategies for preventing any investigation into the matter. The captain also revealed that several members of the House of Lords had privately expressed doubts about Queen Camilla's right to rule, but had been discouraged from voicing these concerns publicly. He named specific peers who had been approached by palace representatives and warned about the consequences of speaking out. Wellington's Final revelation concerned ongoing efforts to rewrite historical records to support the Queen's claim to legitimacy. He presented evidence showing how official documents were being altered and how historians were being pressured to modify their interpretations of royal succession laws. The press conference lasted nearly 2 hours, with Wellington answering every question put to him. His calm demeanor and detailed responses lent credibility to his extraordinary allegations. By the time he finished, it was clear that the monarchy faced its most serious crisis in generations. As Wellington left the courthouse, he was immediately surrounded by reporters and photographers. He made no further statements, simply walking to a waiting car with his lawyer. Behind them, the assembled media continued their frenzied coverage, knowing that this story would dominate headlines for weeks to come. Within minutes of the press conference ending, news of Wellington's allegations was spreading across social media and news websites around the world. The palace had not yet responded to the accusations, but it was clear that Queen Camilla's reign was about to face its most serious test. The reaction to Captain Wellington's explosive press conference was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, news networks across the globe were broadcasting his allegations, and social media platforms were flooded with discussions about the legitimacy of Queen Camilla's reign. The hashtag for a royal crisis began trending worldwide as millions of people shared their opinions about the shocking revelations. Buckingham Palace found itself in an impossible position. The Queen's press secretary, David Morrison, had been bombarded with calls from journalists demanding an official response. Morrison, a seasoned professional who had handled numerous royal scandals, admitted privately that this crisis was unlike anything he had ever faced. The first official response came 3 hours after Wellington's press conference ended. It was a brief statement denying all allegations and describing the captain as a disgruntled former employee seeking attention. However, this dismissive approach only served to fuel more speculation and criticism from media commentators who noted the palace's failure to address specific evidence presented. Meanwhile, political leaders found themselves in an extremely delicate situation. The Prime Minister, Rebecca Hayes, had been caught completely off guard by Wellington's revelations. Her government had supported Queen Camilla's coronation and now faced questions about their own role in the alleged constitutional violations. Parliamentary opposition leaders seized the opportunity to demand a full investigation into the coronation process. Liberal Democrat leader Michael Stone called for an emergency session of Parliament to address what he termed a fundamental threat to British democracy. The Labour leader echoed these concerns, stating that the monarchy's legitimacy was now in serious doubt. International reaction was equally intense. European monarchies distanced themselves from the controversy, with several royal houses privately expressing concern about the implications for constitutional monarchy as an institution. The President of France issued a carefully worded statement about respecting British internal affairs while noting the importance of constitutional legitimacy. Public opinion polls conducted within days of the press conference revealed a nation deeply divided. Approximately 40% of respondents believed Wellington's allegations deserved serious investigation, while 35% dismissed them as fabricated. The remaining 25% remained undecided, waiting for more evidence to emerge. Street protests began appearing in major cities across Britain. In London, thousands of demonstrators gathered outside Buckingham Palace demanding answers from the Queen. Counter-protesters also appeared, defending the monarchy and accusing Wellington of treason. Police struggled to maintain order as tensions escalated between the opposing groups. The media's investigation into Wellington's claims began producing corroborating evidence. Several former palace employees came forward anonymously to confirm details of the captain's allegations. A retired constitutional lawyer discovered irregularities in the official coronation documents that supported Wellington's claims about bypassed procedures. Queen Camilla herself remained conspicuously absent from public view following the press conference. Palace sources claimed she was dealing with urgent state business, but critics noted that she had canceled all scheduled public appearances. This absence only intensified speculation about the validity of Wellington's accusations. The financial markets reacted negatively to the constitutional crisis. The pound sterling dropped to its lowest level in months as investors worried about political instability. Tourism bookings for royal attractions declined sharply as international visitors postponed trips to Britain amid the uncertainty. Legal experts began analyzing the evidence presented by Wellington, and many concluded that his allegations raised serious constitutional questions. Professor Elizabeth Hartwell, a renowned expert on royal succession law, stated publicly that if Wellington's claims were accurate, it could represent the most significant constitutional crisis since the abdication of Edward VIII. Religious leaders also found themselves drawn into the controversy. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who had performed Queen Camilla's coronation, faced intense pressure to comment on the allegations. His initial silence was interpreted by some as tacit acknowledgement of the concerns raised about the ceremony's legitimacy. Behind the scenes, powerful figures within the establishment began choosing sides. Several prominent peers privately contacted opposition politicians to express their concerns about the situation. Some senior civil servants started distancing themselves from the Queen's administration, fearing association with a potentially illegitimate regime. The intelligence services found themselves in an unprecedented position, having to investigate allegations involving the head of state. MI5 quietly began reviewing palace security protocols and examining whether any national security implications arose from the constitutional crisis. Wellington himself had gone into hiding with his family, following death threats from extreme royalist supporters. His lawyer reported that they were receiving credible threats against the captain's safety and had been forced to request police protection. This development further inflamed public opinion on both sides of the debate. International legal scholars began weighing in on the controversy, with some suggesting that Britain might be facing a crisis of legitimacy that could have far-reaching consequences for the Commonwealth realms. Several former British colonies with the monarch as head of state began discussing the implications for their own constitutional arrangements. The crisis deepened when a senior judge announced that his court would consider hearing a formal legal challenge to Queen Camilla's right to rule. This development marked the first time in modern history that the British legal system might be asked to rule on the legitimacy of a reigning monarch. As the first week following Wellington's revelations drew to a close, it became clear that this was not a scandal that would quickly fade from public attention. The fundamental questions raised about constitutional legitimacy demanded answers, and the monarchy's future hung in the balance as the nation waited for the next development in this extraordinary crisis. 2 weeks after Captain Wellington's bombshell revelations, the investigation had taken several dramatic turns that surprised even the most seasoned political observers. A special parliamentary committee had been hastily formed to examine the constitutional implications of the allegations, while Scotland Yard launched a formal criminal investigation into potential fraud and conspiracy charges. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Amanda Foster, a senior archivist at the National Archives, discovered a cache of documents that had been deliberately misfiled during the chaotic period surrounding Queen Camilla's coronation. These papers contained correspondence between palace officials and government lawyers that seemed to confirm Wellington's claims about procedural irregularities. The documents revealed that several constitutional experts had warned palace officials about the legal problems with the coronation process, but their concerns had been dismissed or ignored. One particularly damaging memo showed that the Queen's private secretary had been aware of the issues but proceeded with the ceremony anyway, gambling that no one would challenge the legitimacy later. Meanwhile, Wellington's legal team had been busy building their case with additional evidence. They discovered that 3 members of the Privy Council had submitted formal objections to the coronation process, but these objections had been buried in bureaucratic procedures and never properly addressed. The existence of these objections provided crucial support for Wellington's allegations. The international dimension of the crisis expanded when the Governor-General of Australia announced that his government was conducting its own review of Queen Camilla's status as head of state. Similar statements followed from Canada and New Zealand, suggesting that the constitutional crisis could potentially dissolve the Commonwealth structure that had existed for decades. Public pressure continued to mount as more former palace employees came forward with their own testimonies. A retired lady-in-waiting revealed that she had witnessed heated arguments between Queen Camilla and senior advisors about the coronation timeline. A former protocol officer confirmed that several important ceremonies had been abbreviated or omitted entirely during the crowning process. The most significant development came when Lord Chancellor Patricia Williams announced that the government would no longer oppose a judicial review of the coronation process. This decision represented a dramatic shift in the official position and suggested that even the government was beginning to doubt the Queen's legitimacy. Queen Camilla finally broke her silence during a carefully staged television address to the nation. Speaking from the throne room at Buckingham Palace, she denied all allegations and accused her critics of attempting to destabilize the monarchy for political gain. However, her speech was widely criticized as defensive and unconvincing, particularly when she refused to answer specific questions about the evidence presented. The Queen's appearance seemed to backfire spectacularly. Opinion polls showed that public support for her had dropped to historic lows, with only 28% of respondents expressing confidence in her leadership. More troubling for the palace, support for the monarchy as an institution had also declined significantly. Opposition politicians seized on the Queen's weak performance to demand her immediate abdication. Liberal Democrat leader Michael Stone organized a dramatic walkout from Parliament during the weekly Prime Minister's questions, declaring that his party could no longer recognize Camilla as the legitimate sovereign. The crisis took an even more serious turn when several senior military officers privately expressed concerns about their oath of allegiance to the crown. While they stopped short of public statements, defense officials confirmed that discussions were taking place about the military's position if the Queen's legitimacy was formally challenged in court. Intelligence sources revealed that foreign governments were closely monitoring the situation and preparing contingency plans for dealing with a potentially illegitimate British government. Some allied nations had already begun informal discussions about how to handle diplomatic relations if the constitutional crisis was not resolved. The economic impact continued to worsen as the pound reached new lows against major currencies. The Bank of England governor issued an unusual statement, calling for rapid resolution of the political uncertainty, noting that continued instability could force emergency economic measures. Wellington's safety remained a serious concern as extreme royalist groups made increasingly violent threats against him and his family. Police arrested several individuals for making credible death threats, and the captain was forced to relocate to a secure location, under armed protection. The legal challenge to Queen Camilla's legitimacy gained momentum when several prominent barristers agreed to represent the challengers pro bono. The case was assigned to the High Court's most senior judge, Lord Justice Harrison, who announced that he would fast-track the proceedings given their constitutional importance. Public demonstrations continued across the country, with increasingly large crowds gathering outside Buckingham Palace each day. The protest remained largely peaceful, but police expressed concerns about potential violence as tensions continued to escalate between supporters and opponents of the Queen. Media coverage reached fever pitch as international news organizations sent their top correspondents to London to cover what many were calling the biggest constitutional crisis in British history. The story dominated front pages around the world, with many foreign newspapers questioning whether the British monarchy could survive intact. Behind the scenes, senior establishment figures began engaging in desperate damage control efforts. Former prime ministers from both major parties issued a joint statement calling for calm and constitutional resolution of the crisis, but their intervention had little impact on public opinion. The Church of England found itself deeply divided over the controversy. Several bishops publicly questioned the legitimacy of the coronation they had supported, while others defended the Queen and called for unity. The Archbishop of Canterbury faced increasing pressure to take a clear position on the constitutional issues raised. As the investigation continued to gather evidence, it became increasingly clear that the allegations against Queen Camilla were not going to disappear. The constitutional crisis had developed its own momentum, and powerful forces on all sides were positioning themselves for what promised to be a historic confrontation over the very nature of British democracy and the future of the monarchy. The High Court hearing that would determine Queen Camilla's fate began on a gray Monday morning in late November. Lord Justice Harrison's courtroom was packed with lawyers, journalists and observers who understood they were witnessing a historic moment in British constitutional law. Outside, thousands of protesters and supporters had gathered, creating a tense atmosphere that required a massive police presence. Captain Wellington arrived at court under heavy security, accompanied by his legal team and surrounded by armed police officers. Death threats against him had intensified in recent days, and authorities were taking no chances with his safety. His wife Sarah and children had been moved to an undisclosed location after their home was vandalized by extremist supporters of the Queen. The case for challenging Queen Camilla's legitimacy was presented by Sir Geoffrey Blackwood, one of Britain's most respected constitutional lawyers. In his opening statement, Blackwood methodically outlined the evidence of procedural irregularities, document destruction, and witness intimidation that had come to light over the previous months. Blackwood's presentation was devastating in its precision and detail. He showed the court how crucial constitutional requirements had been bypassed during the coronation process, including the failure to properly consult the Privy Council and the omission of key ceremonial elements that had legal significance. The lawyer argued that these violations rendered the entire coronation invalid under British law. The government's defense was led by the Attorney General, Maria Gonzalez, who faced the difficult task of defending a process that even government documents now showed to be flawed. Her strategy focused on arguing that minor procedural irregularities could not invalidate the fundamental legitimacy of the monarchy, but her arguments appeared weak against the mounting evidence. A key moment came when Dr. Amanda Foster, the archivist who had discovered the buried documents, testified about the systematic effort to hide evidence of the coronation problems. Her testimony revealed that palace officials had deliberately misfiled crucial papers and pressured archival staff to remain silent about what they had witnessed. The court heard dramatic testimony from several former palace employees who had been intimidated into silence. A former private secretary to Queen Camilla described being threatened with prosecution under the Official Secrets Act when he raised concerns about the coronation process. His testimony painted a picture of an administration willing to use any means necessary to suppress dissent. Wellington himself took the witness stand on the third day of hearings. Under intense questioning from both sides, he calmly recounted his 23 years of faithful service and explained how his conscience had compelled him to speak out. His military bearing and obvious sincerity impressed observers and seemed to strengthen the case against the Queen. The most explosive moment came when Wellington revealed that he had secretly recorded a conversation between Queen Camilla and her private secretary shortly after the coronation. In the recording, the Queen could be heard discussing strategies for dealing with potential legal challenges to her legitimacy and expressing satisfaction that opposition voices had been successfully silenced. The palace's response to this revelation was swift and desperate. Queen Camilla's lawyers immediately challenged the admissibility of the recording, arguing that it violated privacy laws and had been obtained illegally. However, the judge ruled that the constitutional significance of the evidence outweighed privacy concerns. Public reaction to the court proceedings was intense and divided. Supporters of Wellington praised his courage in exposing what they saw as a fundamental threat to British democracy. Royalist groups denounced him as a traitor and demanded his prosecution for treason. The divide in public opinion reflected deeper questions about the role of monarchy in modern Britain. International observers noted that the case was being closely watched by constitutional scholars worldwide. The outcome could set important precedents for how democratic societies deal with questions of legitimacy in their governing institutions. Several foreign governments privately expressed concern about the stability of their key ally. The economic impact of the prolonged crisis continued to worsen. The uncertainty surrounding the monarchy's future had created volatility in financial markets and deterred foreign investment. Business leaders called for rapid resolution of the constitutional questions, warning that continued instability could trigger a recession. As the hearing entered its second week, additional evidence emerged that further damaged Queen Camilla's position. A forensic analysis of palace communications revealed that dozens of potentially incriminating messages had been deliberately deleted shortly after Wellington's initial allegations became public. The Crown's case suffered another blow when Lord Justice Harrison ruled that evidence of the cover-up could be considered by the court. This decision opened the door for prosecutors to argue that the palace's attempts to destroy evidence demonstrated consciousness of guilt regarding the original constitutional violations. Religious leaders found themselves increasingly forced to take sides in the crisis. Several prominent bishops publicly questioned whether they could continue to support a monarch whose legitimacy was in serious doubt. The Archbishop of Canterbury faced calls for his resignation over his role in the controversial coronation ceremony. Behind the scenes, senior establishment figures were reportedly exploring potential solutions to the constitutional crisis. Some sources suggested that discussions were taking place about a possible voluntary abdication by Queen Camilla in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Though the palace vehemently denied these rumors, the military's position remained uncertain as senior officers continued to grapple with questions about their oath of allegiance. Some defense experts warned that a constitutional crisis of this magnitude could potentially compromise Britain's national security if key institutions lost legitimacy in the eyes of the public. As the court proceedings continued, it became increasingly clear that regardless of the final verdict, the monarchy would emerge fundamentally changed from this crisis. The questions raised about constitutional legitimacy had opened debates about the future of hereditary power in democratic societies that would continue long after the immediate legal issues were resolved. The nation held its breath as Lord Justice Harrison prepared to deliver what many believed would be the most important constitutional ruling in British history. The judgment would not only determine Queen Camilla's fate, but could reshape the relationship between traditional institutions and democratic accountability in the 21st century. The resolution came not through further legal battles or political maneuvering, but through a quiet conversation in a private room at Buckingham Palace on a snow-covered January evening. Queen Camilla sat across from her eldest son, Tom Parker Bowles, and her longtime friend and confidant, Lady Sarah McCorquodale, as they helped her face the inevitable reality that her reign could not continue. The tipping point had come earlier. That day when the Archbishop of Canterbury formally withdrew the Church's recognition of her coronation, citing the court's findings about constitutional irregularities. This action effectively removed the religious foundation of her claim to the throne and left her isolated even from her most traditional supporters. Military leaders had also made their position clear through private channels. The Chief of Defense Staff informed Downing Street that the armed forces could no longer guarantee their loyalty to a monarch whose legitimacy had been rejected by the courts. This development raised the specter of a complete breakdown in the constitutional order. The final blow came when her own son publicly stated that he believed his mother should step aside for the good of the nation. Tom Parker Bowles' statement, delivered at a carefully arranged press conference, emphasized that the monarchy's survival required acceptance of judicial authority and constitutional accountability. As evening fell, Queen Camilla sat alone in the throne room where she had delivered her defiant address just weeks earlier. The weight of the crown, both literal and metaphorical, had become unbearable. She understood that her continued resistance was not protecting the monarchy but threatening to destroy it entirely. The abdication statement was drafted with the help of constitutional experts and palace lawyers. It acknowledged the court's concerns about procedural irregularities while stopping short of admitting wrongdoing. The Queen expressed her desire to preserve the institution of monarchy for future generations by stepping aside during this constitutional crisis. The announcement was made at 9 o'clock that evening, broadcast simultaneously on all major television networks. Speaking from the same throne room, Queen Camilla appeared smaller and frailer than in her previous appearances. Her voice was steady but filled with emotion as she read the carefully crafted statement. She began by thanking the British people for their support during her brief reign and acknowledging the constitutional questions that had been raised about her coronation. Without explicitly admitting fault, she accepted responsibility for the procedural irregularities that had occurred and apologized for any damage caused to the monarchy's reputation. The most significant moment came when Queen Camilla announced that she was immediately abdicating all claims to the throne and relinquishing all royal titles and privileges. She stated that her decision was made in the best interests of the nation and the constitutional monarchy that had served Britain for centuries. The Queen's final words as monarch were particularly poignant. She spoke about the honor of serving the British people and expressed hope that the monarchy would emerge stronger from this crisis. She concluded by asking for understanding and forgiveness from those she had disappointed during this turbulent period. The immediate reaction to the abdication was one of relief mixed with uncertainty. Financial markets responded positively to the news, with the pound recovering some of its recent losses as investors welcomed the resolution of the constitutional crisis. However, questions remained about the succession and the future structure of the monarchy. Captain Wellington watched the abdication speech from his secure location, accompanied by his wife Sarah and their children. The man who had sparked the greatest constitutional crisis in modern British history felt no triumph in the Queen's downfall, only sadness that it had come to this point. He had acted out of duty to the Constitution, not personal animosity toward Queen Camilla. The succession question was resolved more quickly than many expected. Prince William, who had maintained careful neutrality throughout the crisis, issued a statement accepting the responsibilities of kingship. His approach was markedly different from his predecessor, emphasizing transparency, constitutional compliance, and accountability to democratic institutions. William's first act as monarch was to meet privately with Captain Wellington, thanking him for his service to the Constitution and offering him reinstatement in the Royal Guard if he desired. Wellington respectfully declined, stating that his mission was complete and that he wished to return to private life with his family. The new king's coronation was scheduled for the following spring, but preparations emphasized strict adherence to constitutional requirements and full transparency in all procedures. Legal experts were consulted at every stage to ensure that the mistakes of the previous coronation would not be repeated. Parliamentary investigations into the constitutional crisis continued for several months, resulting in significant reforms to the coronation process and new oversight mechanisms for royal ceremonies. The Privy Council was given enhanced powers to review succession procedures, and the courts were granted explicit authority to adjudicate constitutional disputes involving the monarchy. Queen Camilla retired to a private estate in Scotland, largely withdrawing from public life. She was granted a modest pension in recognition of her brief service, but stripped of all official titles and ceremonial roles. Her supporters gradually accepted the new reality. Though some continued to believe she had been unfairly treated, Captain Wellington eventually wrote a book about his experiences, titled Duty and Conscience, A Guardsman's Constitutional Crisis. The memoir became a bestseller and helped establish him as a respected voice on constitutional matters. He used the proceeds to establish a foundation promoting transparency and accountability in government institutions. The international community largely welcomed the resolution of the British constitutional crisis. Allied governments expressed confidence in the renewed stability of their key partner, though the events had raised important questions about the role of traditional monarchies in modern democratic societies. The Church of England underwent its own period of reflection following the crisis. The Archbishop of Canterbury introduced new protocols for royal ceremonies and emphasized the Church's responsibility to uphold constitutional law even when it conflicted with traditional loyalties. Public opinion gradually shifted toward acceptance of the new arrangements. Polling showed that while the crisis had temporarily damaged support for the monarchy, King William's transparent approach and commitment to constitutional governance had begun to restore confidence in the institution. The case established important legal precedents that were studied by constitutional scholars worldwide. Lord Justice Harrison's ruling affirmed the principle that no institution, however ancient or revered, was above the law in a democratic society. The decision strengthened judicial authority and clarified the court's role in constitutional disputes. Years later, historians would mark Queen Camilla's abdication as a turning point that ultimately strengthened British democracy. The crisis forced a necessary conversation about institutional accountability and resulted in reforms that made the monarchy more compatible with modern democratic expectations. Captain Wellington's courage in speaking truth to power became a symbol of how individual conscience could serve the greater constitutional good. His story reminded future generations that democratic institutions depend on citizens willing to uphold their principles, even when facing personal cost. The monarchy survived the crisis, but it emerged fundamentally changed. The absolute deference that had traditionally surrounded royal authority was replaced by a more balanced relationship between crown and constitution. This transformation, though painful, ultimately secured the institution's future in a democratic age. The events that began with one man's moral courage had reshaped the British constitutional system and demonstrated that even the most established institutions must earn their legitimacy through adherence to democratic principles and the rule of law. Lord Justice Harrison's judgment was delivered on a cold December morning that would forever be remembered in British constitutional history. The courtroom was silent as the distinguished judge began reading his carefully crafted decision, which had taken him 3 weeks to prepare. Every word carried enormous weight, knowing that his ruling would determine not just Queen Camilla's fate, but potentially the future of the monarchy itself. The judge began by acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the case and the profound constitutional questions it raised. He emphasized that the court's duty was to uphold the law regardless of political consequences, and that no person or institution, however exalted, was above constitutional requirements. Harrison's analysis of the evidence was methodical and devastating. He found that multiple constitutional procedures had indeed been violated during Queen Camilla's coronation, including the failure to properly consult the Privy Council and the omission of legally required ceremonial elements. The judge determined that these were not minor technical irregularities, but fundamental breaches of constitutional law. Most damaging to the Queen's position was Harrison's finding regarding the cover-up. The judge ruled that the systematic destruction of evidence and intimidation of witnesses represented a serious attempt to pervert the course of justice. He noted that these actions demonstrated clear consciousness of guilt about the original constitutional violations. The moment everyone had been waiting for came when Harrison delivered his final ruling. In measured tones that carried across the hushed courtroom, he declared that Queen Camilla's coronation had been fundamentally flawed and that her claim to the throne lacked proper constitutional foundation. The judge ordered that she immediately cease exercising royal prerogatives pending further legal proceedings. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Gasps echoed through the courtroom as the full implications of the ruling became clear. Queen Camilla had effectively been declared an illegitimate monarch by Britain's highest court, creating a constitutional crisis of unprecedented magnitude. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in chaos. Wellington supporters cheered and celebrated what they saw as a victory for constitutional law and democratic accountability. Royalist protesters responded with anger and dismay, with some calling for resistance against what they termed a judicial coup. The palace's initial response was defiant. A statement issued within hours of the judgment rejected the court's authority to rule on matters of royal succession and announced that Queen Camilla would continue to exercise her constitutional duties. This position created an extraordinary standoff between the monarchy and the judicial system. Political leaders found themselves navigating uncharted constitutional territory. Prime Minister Rebecca Hayes convened an emergency cabinet meeting to discuss the government's response to the crisis. Opposition leaders demanded that she immediately withdraw support for Queen Camilla and recognize the court's authority. The international reaction was swift and concerned. Allied governments expressed alarm at the constitutional chaos engulfing their key partner. Several Commonwealth realms announced that they were reviewing their own relationships with the Crown, pending resolution of the legitimacy crisis. Financial markets reacted with panic to the ruling. The pound plummeted to historic lows as investors fled what they perceived as a fundamentally unstable political system. The Bank of England was forced to intervene in currency markets to prevent a complete collapse of confidence in British institutions. Military commanders found themselves in an impossible position as they grappled with conflicting loyalties. Some senior officers reportedly met in emergency session to discuss their constitutional obligations, while defense officials worked frantically to prevent any breakdown in command structure. The Church of England faced its own crisis as bishops struggled to respond to the court ruling. Several prominent clerics announced that they could no longer recognize Queen Camilla's spiritual authority, while others defended the traditional relationship between Crown and Church. Wellington himself remained in protective custody as threats against his life intensified following the ruling. Extremist royalist groups had vowed revenge against the man they blamed for destroying the monarchy, while his supporters hailed him as a hero of constitutional democracy. The crisis deepened when several senior civil servants announced that they could no longer serve a government that refused to recognize the court's authority. These resignations threatened to paralyze key government departments and highlighted the extent to which the legitimacy crisis had infected the entire state apparatus. Queen Camilla's position became increasingly untenable as political and institutional support continued to erode. Several members of the royal family privately expressed concerns about her refusal to accept the court's ruling, fearing that her defiance could bring down the entire monarchical system. Public opinion polls showed the nation more divided than ever, with roughly equal numbers supporting and opposing the court's decision. However, younger voters overwhelmingly supported the ruling, suggesting that the monarchy's long-term future was increasingly uncertain. Behind the scenes, desperate negotiations were reportedly taking place between palace officials and government representatives to find a face-saving exit strategy for Queen Camilla. Some sources suggested that discussions involved a possible voluntary abdication in exchange for immunity from criminal prosecution. The constitutional scholar Professor Elizabeth Hartwell noted that Britain was experiencing its gravest institutional crisis since the English Civil War. She warned that the conflict between judicial authority and royal prerogative could fundamentally reshape the British system of government regardless of how it was ultimately resolved. International legal experts began arriving in London to observe what many considered the most important constitutional case of the modern era. The precedent established by Harrison's ruling could influence how other democratic societies deal with questions of institutional legitimacy and accountability. As the nation struggled to process the implications of the court ruling, it became clear that Britain had entered uncharted constitutional waters. The monarchy's thousand-year history had reached a critical juncture, and the decisions made in the coming days would determine whether this ancient institution could adapt to modern democratic expectations or would become another casualty of changing times.